Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled How to Manage Executive Function and Working Memory Challenges, a guide for adults with ADHD. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Peg Dawson. Dr. Dawson received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Virginia. She was a school psychologist and worked at the Center for Learning and Attention Disorders, assessing children and adults. She has authored many books, including one for adults seeking to strengthen their executive functioning skills. It's called The Smart but Scattered Guide to Success. No one is born with executive function skills, but just about everyone can learn them. Executive function skills help us to manage everyday tasks such as planning ahead, setting and following through on goals, managing time, remembering information, and managing emotions. As we know all too well, many people with ADHD have weak executive function skills, and that can make life even more challenging and stressful. In today's webinar, we'll learn about the strategies that adults can use to improve their executive function skills and get things done. We'd like to begin today's webinar asking this poll question to our live audience. What aspect of executive function feels most challenging in your daily life? Please select your answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. For answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. If you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit additudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude magazine. For subscribers who've already received the winter issue, we have a special deal for you. Flip to page 5 for a coupon code that gets you a money-saving discount on our latest ebook, The Adult's Guide to Stronger Executive Functions. If you sign up for ADDitude magazine today, you can still get the winter issue. And with our 2-for-1 holiday offer going on right now, you'll get a second subscription for free. So sign up for ADDitude magazine for yourself and to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Click the magazine tab on screen to learn more. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Inflow. Struggling to keep track of tasks or organize your thoughts? You're not alone. For adults with ADHD, working memory and executive function challenges can make daily life feel overwhelming. That's where Inflow comes in. Its science-backed app offers targeted insights and brain hacks to strengthen your mental juggling skills and boost your ability to plan, prioritize, and follow through. Ready to unlock your brain's full potential? Click the link on screen to take Inflow's free quiz today and start your journey to better cognitive control. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Peg Dawson. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading this discussion.
Okay, thanks. And I'm happy to be here. And I'll just put in my own personal plug for ADDitude magazine. I've found it over the years very helpful, full of practical tips and covering topics that I think are really critical to understanding and working with both kids and adults with ADHD. So plug for that. They didn't ask me to do that. I'm just saying it. So I'm going to start by just giving you my quick introduction to what executive skills are. And then we'll start talking about strategies and ways of managing both executive function skill challenges in general and working memory challenges. So executive skills are brain-based skills. They're managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain, which is the part of the brain right behind the forehead. And they take a minimum of 25 years to reach full maturation. And that's in typically developing individuals. In general, experts on ADHD maintain it may take longer with people with ADHD. They are basically the skills that support goal-directed behavior or Another way of saying them, the skills required to execute tasks. We call them executive skills. They are more commonly referred to as executive functions. We chose to call them executive skills because we wanted the emphasis to be on skills. You know, skill implies whatever level you're at, you can get better at it. Function doesn't give me that same sense. When I think of the word function, I think, okay, it means use. And then I start picturing refrigerators and photocopy machines. So a lot of people combine the two and call them executive function skills. Again, I'm happy with that because that keeps skills in the title. There are a lot of different models out there for executive skills. This is the one we focus on. We basically describe 12 executive skills that we think are most critical to adult success in 3 settings, basically, in the workplace, at home, and in relationships. And so these are the 12 skills we talk about. The order, I've started dividing them recently into foundational skills and advanced skills, which is more important for the work I do with people who work with kids, but I think it's still helpful to keep in mind. The foundational skills are the first skills to develop. Many of them are emerging during the first year of life. The order in which I've listed them there is roughly the order in which we think they emerge developmentally, again, starting from shortly after birth. The advanced skills, I mean, you just look at them, you can tell they are more complicated skills. That order is a little more arbitrary. A lot of those, too, can be developing around the same time. Metacognition is a late developing skill, and it actually informs the development or the progress of executive skills in general, but advanced skills in particular. Because metacognition is the ability to use your thoughts. To solve problems, make sense out of things, understand the world, understand yourself. And so you can see that if you have good metacognition, you're going to be better at planning and prioritizing, at creating organizational systems, at managing time, at setting goals and managing stress. So those are the 12 skills that we talk about. Just quickly, this is based on my clinical experience as much as anything else in terms of the relationship between executive skills and ADHD. Most of the symptoms associated with ADHD could be classified as challenges with executive skills, including all the inattention symptoms and most of the hyperactive impulsive systems. So all adults with ADHD have executive skill challenges. Not all adults with executive skill challenges have ADHD. There are different profiles associated with different learning or psychological disorders. And to be honest, one of the things we've discovered over years and years of working with these concepts is that it's, in our experience, it's more typical for adults to have stronger and weaker skills than it is to as an adult, to have all your executive skills be evenly and well developed across the board. When we look at, again, this is based on my clinical experience, but it also, especially with the executive skill challenges, it connects to the symptoms associated with ADHD. So let's start with the challenges first. In our framework for understanding executive skills, the executive skills that tend to be most problematic or most challenging for people with ADHD are task initiation, sustained attention, time management, and response inhibition. I put that in parentheses because that is problems with response inhibition tend to be more prevalent with people who have the ADHD hyperactive impulsive type. Although there's a distractibility component to response inhibition, which can occur across types. But to me, what's most interesting about our profile and our understanding of executive skills is to look at the strengths that many adults with ADHD have. Now, by the time an ADHD adult has reached adulthood, they're pretty aware of what their challenges are. They may not be aware of what their strengths are. And these are the ones that we find to be most commonly present, in, at least I will say, in the adults that I've done assessments with ADHD. Flexibility is often a strength for them. That's the ability to sort of go with the flow, to switch gears if you have to adjust to unexpected changes in plans. Metacognition is also often a strength with adults with ADHD. And that's the ability to sort of see the big picture, to pick up on all the cues in your environment, make sense out of them. And it makes sense because if you're having trouble focusing in to pay attention, that means you're picking up a lot of other cues. And that's where metacognition starts in a way. And then stress tolerance. And again, that's more commonly seen in the hyperactive impulsive type of people with ADHD. But it's helpful for adults with ADHD, and for those of you who work with adults with ADHD, to particularly to remind them of their strengths, because very often the adults I've seen often feel beaten down by the challenges, and they may be overlooking their strengths. Okay, so with that sort of as well, actually, there's a couple other things I want to say before I start addressing the main topic of the presentation. I don't know where I found this. Someone sent it to me a couple of years ago, and I just think it captures so many of the adults that I know of with ADHD, and kids for that matter too. One of the questions I often get asked by teachers or parents is, how come kids with ADHD or people with ADHD have no trouble focusing on some things and have huge trouble focusing on others? So someone suggested that there's an acronym, ICNU, that defines the factors that influence the ability of someone with ADHD to focus. So it's how interesting the task is, how challenging it is, how novel it is, or how urgent it is. And the example that was provided was doing the dishes. Is it interesting? No, not even close. Is it challenging? Not really. Is it novel? No. Is it urgent? Not yet. Will the dishes get cleaned? Only when they're needed right now. So that may help you. Again, those of you who live with people with ADHD and are trying to figure out why they can pay attention and sustain attention to some tasks and not others, that acronym may help you understand that. So now let's look at working memory. Working memory is a particular kind of memory, and it's basically defined by how short working memory is and how little it can hold in memory at any one time. It is exactly what it says it is. It's the ability to work with information and hold it in mind at the same time. So if I want to stress this out in a testing situation, I could ask someone a multi-step math problem and ask them to solve it in their head. So they have to hold on to all the information in the question. They have to figure out what step they're on, and they have to keep the specific numbers in mind. They have to pull from long-term memory into working memory, whatever math procedures they have to learn, whatever. So I found a book a few years ago called Working Memory Capacity, because when I was an undergraduate psych major, we talked about 7. That's how much the human brain can hold on to at any one time. Actually, it was a very famous article called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2 that really sort of was defining working memory in those days, before they were even calling it working memory. But a couple of years ago, I got curious to know, are we really talking about 7? We can hold 7 items in mind plus or minus 2, or is that changed in the over 50 years since I was an undergraduate psych major? So here's what I found. Working memory has a capacity of about 4 chunks in young adults and fewer in children and old adults. Furthermore, we can only hold information in working memory for about 10 to 15 seconds. Now, in all the words on that page, the key word is chunk. We can hold more information in mind than 4 if we chunk it. And the perfect example of that is the telephone number, right? 10 digits, but we chunk it 3, 3, and 4. Or a social security number, 9 digits, but we chunk it 3, 2, and 4. So that's how we're able to manage. But if after 10 or 15 seconds, if we haven't figured out a way to store that information or rehearse it, it's gone. So as I say, working memory is constrained by both capacity and time. And in general, although I didn't list it as one of my challenges associated with ADHD, because I think it's fairly variable in adults with ADHD, it can be problematic for people with ADHD. The key, though, is, are they having trouble remembering because their working memory is limited, or because they weren't paying attention when the information was given to them? So that's important distinction to understand as well. So In general, and I've talked with experts in the working memory field, and in general, the understanding is that you can't increase working memory capacity. You can't, through practice or anything else, expand your ability to remember stuff. So my advice for ADHD adults who struggle with working memory is to help them identify the cues and reminders that work best for them, rather than looking for ways to strengthen their working memory. So alarms on smartphones, for instance, rather than trying to remember to do something at a certain time, even if it's something you have to do at the same time every day, put an alarm in your smartphone, or ask someone to remind you, or put a Post-it right by the door to remind you to bring your laptop to work or something like that. So that's what I mean by finding cues and reminders that can work, rather than spending time trying to stretch your working memory. Okay. So I want to go on and talk about tips for managing executive skill challenges in general. And the book that we wrote that really addresses executive skills in adults, which is called The Smart But Scattered Guide to Success, was really built on the books we wrote for kids. It took us a while to write the book for adults because we weren't sure adults could change. We finally decided, yes, they were. But basically, the same strategies that we have found work very well with kids can be tweaked to work with adults. And so they really sort of fall into, you can see my four tips here. Set up the environment to reduce the impact of the weak skill. So is there some way that you can put cues in the environment if it's something you have to remember? Or let's say you have problems with response inhibition. And so you have a tendency, I'll probably come back to this before we're done. If you have a problem eating unhealthy snacks, you don't work on willpower, you keep the snacks out of the house. So that's what we mean about setting up the environment to reduce the impact of the weak skill. Look for small improvements. I think it's very frustrating for many adults with ADHD because they want to see improvements fast. And one of the things I learned very early on as I started working with adults with ADHD, I was working with a woman who we developed a coaching model and that we designed to work with kids initially. But I remember the first time I used my coaching model with an adult with ADHD, she set like 4 huge goals that had to do with getting her garage clean, fixing her diet, exercising more. I forget what it was. And she went gung-ho at all of them for about 3 weeks. And then all of them fell by the wayside. So I've really moved much more to let's take this one tiny step at a time. Find ways to use incentives to get through non-preferred tasks. And I'll talk about this more in a bit, but and this is the tricky part, because with kids, we can withhold incentives. You can say, well, until you get your homework, I'm not going to hand you to the controls to that video game. With adults have access to whatever incentives they're going to give themselves. And so an adult has to sort of make a pact with themselves. I won't do this, the fun stuff, until I've done this, the hard stuff, or the practice. For if we're working on practicing to improve an executive skill. And then focus on building habits and routines one small step at a time. A lot of what I'm going to talk about from now for the rest of the seminar is about building habits, because in a sense, executive skills are habits of mind. And there's a science behind habit formation, habit strengthening, habit maintenance. And so I'm going to refer to some of that science because I think it's as applicable to adults with ADHD as anybody else. So let's talk about how to form a habit. And the primary source for this information is a great book called Good Habits, Bad Habits by Wendy Wood. You can see it there. And she sort of breaks down habits into a number of different components. And one is context. The setting or situation in which you're trying to develop that habit. And she describes something which she calls friction. So if you're trying to establish a good habit, you want to decrease the friction associated with that habit. So you want to make it easier for that habit to be established. If you're trying to break a bad habit, then you want to increase the friction that makes it that much harder to engage in that bad habit. So for instance, that whole potato chip thing, if you're trying to not eat unhealthy snacks, you would increase friction by leaving the potato chips in the grocery store 5 miles down the road. So in order to eat potato chips, you have to get in your car and drive 5 miles. On the other hand, let's say you're trying to get in shape. And so there you want to decrease the distance between your exercise and where that's going to happen. So you're far more likely to go to the gym if it's next door, or if it's in your basement, than it is if you have to drive 5 miles down the road to get to your gym. So hopefully that makes sense to you. You want to decrease friction in order to establish good habits. You want to increase friction in order to break bad habits. Okay. So repetition is the second part of habit formation, and that is just doing the same thing over and over again with as much consistency as possible. This is the study that answered this question: how long does it take to acquire a habit? And obviously it depends on the habit you're trying to acquire, but this is a meta-analysis. So they looked at all the research they could find on the subject of habit formation. And what they concluded was that on average, it takes 66 days to acquire a habit. But depending on the habit, they found the range was anywhere from 18 to 254 days. So obviously the easier a habit, like increasing the amount of water you drink per day, because you know being hydrated is important, that's an easier habit to establish than a habit that is running 5 miles every day or doing 50 push-ups every day or something like that. That will take longer. So that whole 66 days is an interesting concept, which I've experimented with on a number of occasions. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from my own personal experience. Although I will say I was working with an adult with ADHD. She was a physician and also on the faculty at Harvard Medical School, and she was trying to manage a very complicated, busy life. And so at one point when I was working with her, she had set in place a plan of spending 5 to 10 minutes first thing in the morning creating a plan for the day, because she felt like that made her days more productive. And then she started falling off, and I raised with her this article, and I said, could you try this for 66 days? Let's make an experiment. Let's see what happens. And so she did that. Even when she went on a vacation, she still built in a short planning piece first thing in the morning. I tried this myself with my biggest bugaboo. Organization is my weakest skill. So I tried it with getting my study clean. So this was the way my study looked before I started cleaning it up, which may not look that bad to some of you, but to me, I mean, this was a long time ago because there were actual physical newspapers that I used to subscribe to, and now I read everything online. But you can say I've got piles of stuff there. And so what I decided I was going to do was every day, I was going to spend a little amount of time every day getting my study tidy, and then I was going to continue to keep it tidy. So at the end of every day, I would tidy it up, and I was going to do it for 66 days. And so I marked off on the calendar. I actually was on the road a lot in those days, so it had to be 66 days when I was home. And that worked fairly effectively. And my study has never been that messy since. In fact, I took a picture just this afternoon, but I'd already shared this PowerPoint with ADDitude, so I couldn't change it. But this is one of my recent pictures. So this is what my study looks like. And it takes maybe 5 or 10 minutes to tidy my study. So clearly I've established that habit. Okay, so we've got set up the context, we've got repetition, so we're doing the same thing day in and day out as best we can. And then the third part of establishing a habit is rewarding yourself. And so that's what this says. Context will smooth the way, repetition will jumpstart the engine, but if you aren't getting even a minor reward for your initial effort along the way, you won't get the habit to start operating on its own. And ideally, rewards have to be experienced right after we do something in order to build that habit association. So stimulus response, work reward, or they call it context response. You can see there. And actually, the most effective habit building rewards are often intrinsic to a behavior or part of the action itself. So if you're trying to get in shape and you realize, you know what, when I'm sweating, that makes me feel good because that makes me know that I'm working hard. So feeling that sweat buildup is actually rewarding, and that keeps me going, and that pushes me a little in terms of my exercise. Okay. So for instance, I track this, and let me just give you another example. This is my favorite app. It's called Gold Streaks, and it's free. There are other streaks out there, but look for Gold Streaks if you want to use this. And all you do every day is just put an X on the day that you met your goal. So I decided a while back I needed to get on top of my emails. And so my goal was for 66 straight days, I was going to end at least once a day. I was going to have 0 emails in my inbox. I will tell you that was the hardest thing I've ever done. I mean, there were days when I was up till 9:30 at night and my bedtime is 9 o'clock. Getting through my email just so I could meet that 66 days because I wanted to know what that felt like. I would never do that again. And you can imagine on day 67, I did not stay on top of my emails. So for me, it was an illustration of how hard it is to do anything for 66 days straight. I've got some modifications for that make all the difference in the world, which I will share with you in just a minute. Self-control versus context. We have this notion, and I've worked with adults with ADHD who have these unrealistic ideas that people who don't have ADHD just have better willpower. That they are able to make themselves do stuff they don't want to do, or they're able to not do stuff they do want to do, and it's just built in. And so I need more willpower. But in fact, when you look at, and there's a guy named Baumeister he wrote a book on willpower actually, and he looked at people who rated high on willpower scales. And what he found was they weren't putting themselves into temptation every day and resisting temptation. They were setting up the environment so that they didn't have access to that temptation. And that is way more powerful than trying to use self-control. Because when you have to use self-control, it depletes you. And again, with people who are ADHD, they tend to be context dependent anyway. So they tend then to resist whatever the context clues are for going out, having fun, ignoring what you're supposed to be doing. If they're spending all their time resisting that, that is depleting their energy. So if we set up the environment to reduce the access to the temptation, we're gonna do way better. All right. So now, in the time I have left, I'm just going to give you what I think are the biggest bang for the buck. I call these quick and easy interventions. And I know, depending on the person, nothing's easy. But quick maybe, because I want to share with you my perfect intervention for executive skills. And this is one I initially developed for parents and teachers, but it applies equally well to adults. So here it is. The perfect intervention to support executive skill development is one that takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes a day and that you're willing to do forever or as long as it takes. Now, those two go hand in hand. If it took more than 5 or 10 minutes a day, you wouldn't be able to stick with it long enough for it to work. And I can almost guarantee you that if you do something for 5 or 10 minutes a day on a pretty consistent basis, it won't take forever. It will also take longer than you think it should. And that's particularly advice for parents in the audience who may have kids. It's going to take them longer for them to acquire whatever habit you want them to acquire. But the same is true of adults. What could you do for 5 minutes a day? So for instance, when I first cleaning my study, I thought, okay, I'm going to spend 10 minutes a day until my study gets clean. I set the timer for 10 minutes. When that bell rang, I thought, that is the longest 10 minutes I've ever spent in my life. Organization is a challenge for me. So the next day I said, okay, 5 minutes. We're just going to work at it in 5-minute increments. And that went way better. And as you can see, I eventually got my study clean. Don't let the long-term goal do all the heavy lifting. Again, the research on people who set goals is very often, it's that long-term goal which they try to use to motivate them or inspire them to do whatever it takes. So if they're trying to lose weight or they're trying to do an exercise program, they picture themselves fitting in a dress that's 2 sizes smaller than the one they're wearing now. But that's the long-term goal. And what they find is if people find smaller things that on a daily basis make them feel good, that are associated with working with that non-preferred task, that is way more effective than holding out in the distance that long-term goal that you keep having to remind yourself of. Okay. First, work, then play. Identify something you really want to do that you're willing to forego until that non-preferred task is finished. Real quick story about this. I think I have time to tell this. I was working with a colleague and a coworker, actually. She was on the administrative staff at the mental health center where I worked, and she was as ADD as they come. And at one point she commented to me that her apartment was a mess and she really wanted to get her apartment clean. And so I asked her, I thought, okay, here's a good chance to try this out. So I said to her, is there anything that you really, first of all, what's one small step towards getting your apartment clean that won't take very long? And so she settled on sweeping her kitchen floor. That fits my 5-minute rule probably, right? And then I said to her, okay, is there something you really like to do in the evening after work that you're willing not to do until you've swept the kitchen floor? Well, that actually stumped her. She couldn't think of anything. So I said, well, that was a bust. But when she went home, she emailed me later. When she went home that night, she was still thinking about sweeping the kitchen floor and is there some reward she could use? And she was kicking off her work shoes and taking off her work clothes to switch into her sweats. And she stopped herself and she said, that's it. She put the work shoes back on. She put her work clothes back on and she swept the floor. So for her, the relaxing thing to do for her was to change out of her work clothes. And so she was willing not to do that until she'd done that 5-minute task. So that's just a good example. And it could be anything, as you could see. I mean, changing out of your work clothes would be a preferred task. But for her, it was, and it worked very well. This is my favorite one of all time. Give yourself 2 free passes. This was a big, I don't have time to repeat the whole research article, but it was in a book called How to Change, which I highly recommend, by Katie Milkman. And they looked at a study where they had 3 groups setting goals. And they all had to do the same boring task. But one group, they said, okay, your goal is to do this every day, 7 days a week. Another group, they said, okay, your goal is to do this 5 days a week. The third group, they said to them, okay, your goal is to do this 7 days a week, but you can give yourself 2 free passes. So ultimately, 5 days a week. When they looked afterwards to see who did the best, who achieved their goal the most, who earned the bonus reward, because they had a bonus reward in it for meeting their goal, the group that did the best were the ones who had the goal of 7 days a week, but gave themselves 2 free passes. And in fact, once I did my 66 days of keeping my email at 0 at least once a day, I switched my goal. So my goal now is that I'm going to have 5 emails or less in my inbox at least once a day, 5 days out of 7. So I've given myself 2 free passes. And you can see this is a screenshot I took a few days ago. 253 days I've been able to do that, whereas I could barely do the 66 days to do it every day. So that 2 free passes. And on top of that, because you're doing it 5 days out of 7, you are building that habit almost without thinking. So give yourself 2 free passes. Avoid an all or nothing mentality. If your goal is to exercise for 30 minutes every day and you don't feel up to it, exercise for 5 minutes rather than skipping exercise altogether. Or the same thing, consistency is great, but if your goal is to exercise first thing in the morning and you don't do that, then say, okay, I'll exercise right before lunch. So break that consistency by doing it at another time, rather than not doing it at all. Okay, I think I just have a couple more points. Oh no, this is my last point. This is that Chinese proverb: a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that's my promise. Do something for 5 minutes a day. Take that first step. And you'll hit that 1,000-mile mark. And you'll hit it a whole lot faster than if you set that goal of going 100 miles a day or 50 miles a day, whatever. Okay. Carol,
thank you so much, Dr. Dawson. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Inflow once more for sponsoring this webinar. I'd also like to share the final results from today's poll question. We asked, what aspect of executive function feels most challenging in your daily life? 23% said managing time effectively. 21% said starting tasks. 19% said staying focused on one thing. 13% said staying organized. 13% said planning and prioritizing. And 9% said remembering important details. Now to your questions. My executive function went off a cliff partway into menopause. Is it ever likely to improve? Someone asks.
I've seen articles. Have I seen studies? I think there is some relationship that's been documented between menopause and loss of executive functioning. And I'm so far past menopause, I can't even remember. But my guess is, and I haven't seen this, that the other symptoms associated with menopause decline with time. And so I would be hoping that those executive skills might bounce back as well. Although I have to qualify that by saying the longitudinal research, there's a great book called Executive Skills Across Our Executive Functions Across the Lifespan. And what that research shows is that these skills decline with age. And some more than others. Probably the executive skill that takes the biggest hit as a result of age is working memory. And in fact, interestingly enough, as you see any particular executive skill decline, think about, do you have an executive skill strength you can use to compensate for that? So for instance, when I saw organization was terrible for me, but I was using working memory to compensate for that, so I could throw my car keys wherever and still remember where they were. But as I saw my working memory decline, I had to beef up my organizational skills so that I always put my car keys in the same place. So just something to keep in mind. All of these skills can improve as long as you're realistic about it and as long as you take it step by step.
So I have quite a few questions about aging that I'll just continue with.
Yeah, sure.
So someone asks, how much does age factor into the ADHD challenges associated with executive function? I'm over 65. Can I really still improve my executive function skills?
Yeah, I think, again, I didn't get my study clean until I was after 65. Now, again, I don't have ADHD, although I'm surrounded I have a son with ADHD. I have 2 out of my 3 brothers have ADHD, so it certainly runs in my family. I think it takes commitment. It takes taking a small step and deciding what you really want to focus on. So I always worry about people deciding, oh, I'm going to go from being lousy at time management to being great at time management. Well, that's probably not realistic. But if you think, okay, what aspect of time management is getting me in trouble? And is there something I can do for that? And so I've had people choose being late for a staff meeting or being late for work. And so if you focus on one specific situation that's being impacted by a weak executive skill and put in place a strategy for that, I think you can. I think you can show improvement or gain improvement.
Okay. Another aging related question is, for older adults with ADHD, how can we differentiate between cognitive decline and declining executive functioning? And also, how can we work with our employer to develop workarounds to ensure that we can still provide value?
Okay, good question. And I don't want to go outside my range of expertise on this. So I would want to be looking at, you know, what are the early signs or what does cognitive impairment look like compared to ADHD? And so if I say things like, well, if you look at a potato peeler and forget what you use it for, that's probably a sign of cognitive decline. But that's a really, that's a striking, obvious example, which with most of us with the cognitive decline piece, it's much more subtle than that. I guess all I would say is if you start seeing slippage, which seems to be qualitatively different from where you saw the symptoms associated with your attention disorder, then I would consider consulting a physician, a neurologist, a neuropsychologist to try to get a handle on that. Mm-hmm. And what was there was another part to that question.
Yeah. So the other part of that was, how can we work with our employer to develop workarounds to ensure that we can still provide value in the workplace?
So that also is a tricky question. I mean, we know what the ADA says. The ADA says that you cannot be discriminated against as a result of a disability, whether it's an attention disorder or anything else. And I used to have a fairly cavalier attitude about that until I tested this young woman in her early 20s who had ADHD. And I said, that she just needs to be honest with her employer. Or when she's applying for a job. And her mother told me later, yeah, she didn't get that job. So there's what the law says and there's the reality of it. So I would be approaching those conversations gently with them. I mean, you probably need to, you probably know which employer you likely be able to have that honest conversation with and which not. And if you are concerned that you might lose a job due to an attention disorder or whatever, it may make sense to not necessarily consult a lawyer, but to consult someone like a disabilities rights center or something. But I am now talking, I don't work with older people with ADHD, so I'm now all I'm going on is just my general reasoning as opposed to a specific experience with that.
Okay. Someone asks, given my challenges with executive functioning, is there an environment that's particularly supportive for me where I could thrive?
Okay, that's a great question. Unfortunately, it depends on what your executive skill challenges are. So you can't generally say in general. You have to say, what are your particular executive skills challenges? So, but in general, again, for instance, if working memory is a struggle, then a work environment which has an established routine, where that's not too detail oriented, where you're doing sort of following the same routine day in and day out, that would work better than one where you're where the job is constantly changing and you have to keep track of details. If time management is an issue, then again, an environment that I guess now that I'm thinking about this, the more structure that's in the environment, because structure equals routine, right? Structure enhances habit. So whatever your executive skill challenge is, I would be looking for an environment that provides enough structure and routine so that you're not having to heavily rely on that executive skill challenge, where it's like a scaffold or a support. The environment props you up.
Yeah, okay. Someone asked, how does chronic anxiety and depression play into memory issues that are already present with ADHD?
Yeah, really good question. And when we talk about either of those, anxiety or depression, if we're putting them in executive skill terms, we're talking about problems with emotional control. And it's easier to answer that question around anxiety. Anxiety can have a negative impact on working memory as fast as anything that I can think of, because when you're anxious, you're absorbed, your energy and focus is absorbed on what you're anxious about. And so you don't have easy access to working memory. With depression, I actually, when I think of depression and I think of its impact on executive skills, I'm more likely to think about task initiation and sustained attention. At its most extreme example, people who are depressed have trouble getting out of bed in the morning. So obviously initiating tasks, especially if they're effortful tasks, are going to be problematic for them. And certainly, again, depression comes with this sort of low grade general sense that you have to work hard at everything. And so to that extent, it will interfere with working memory as well. So it can definitely have an impact, both of them.
About task initiation, so we had quite a few questions about how do we even get started. I just can't bring myself to do something that is boring or mundane, and I just can't even begin.
Okay.
Do you have suggestions?
Yeah. So someone in a workshop I did just a couple of weeks ago, when we were talking about task initiation, she said, if you're having trouble getting started, that just means the first step isn't small enough, which I thought was a really interesting way to think about task initiation. Make that first step tiny, so that it, so if you can't get yourself to go to the gym, can you put on your sweats? You don't have to go to the gym. It's just the first step for going to the gym is putting on your exercise clothes. So that's one thing, is make that first step really tiny. The other thing, again, it goes back to that 5-minute rule. Give yourself permission to work only 5 minutes on it. In many cases, when I've talked with people who struggle with task initiation, what they often say to me is, once I get started, I can keep going. But it's just the idea of getting started, because the task seems overwhelming to me. So give yourself permission to only work for 5 minutes, and try that for a few days. And in fact, if you want to keep going, you can, but I would encourage you to sort of not go to the point of exhaustion, to work for 5 minutes and then stop, or work for 5 minutes and say, okay, I'll work for another 5 minutes, so that you're building up this tolerance for doing the unpleasant task that you've been putting off. Because if you jump on the bandwagon too quickly, or if you think, okay, now I've got it, then again, you're going to run into, oh, that task is so overwhelming, it's going to take forever. So make the first step small, and give yourself permission to only work for 5 minutes. And if that's not realistic because there's something you have to do, work it for 5 minutes at a time and then do something else. So sandwich it in between other tasks. There's this great book called, what is it called? Structured Procrastination, I think, where this person said, in fact, my older brother, one of the ones with ADHD, says, when he has some task hanging over his head that he really doesn't want to do, he does all the other things that are on his to-do list. So at least he's using his time productively. So that's another thing to think about, is rather than not doing that task and not doing anything else on your to-do list, at least use your time productively for something else that's on your to-do list.
Okay.
Those are the two things I can think of for that.
Yeah. We've had a few questions around impulsivity. So quite a few people said that they can't control their impulsivity or manage their emotions. They really struggle with this. Do you have some suggestions?
So there's always medication, and I realize that's not what this webinar is about, but stimulant medication is probably the single best treatment for problems with impulsivity. My son, who took stimulants for a while in high school, said to me at one point, you know what Ritalin does? It makes me stop and think before I say or do something. The emotional control piece is interesting. And very often the two go hand in hand, and perhaps the person asking that question, because if you have trouble with impulsivity and emotional control, then your emotions come out very quickly. Something happens and you erupt. I think it's I won't say it's easier to treat the problems with emotional control, but I think we have more effective evidence-based strategies for teaching emotional control. And so, for instance, cognitive behavior therapy and mindfulness meditation. So cognitive behavior therapy is based on the premise that our feelings are not caused by external events. They're caused by what we tell ourselves about those external events. And so if you can reframe what you're telling yourself, then that can make a difference. So for example, my professional work these days is mostly around doing workshops and webinars. And so every once in a while, and I love talking about this stuff, so it's usually not an issue, but every once in a while, I'll wake up in the morning and I'll think, I really don't have the energy for this. And then I think, oh, but this is stuff I'm really excited about, and I get to share my thoughts with other people. And just that reframing. Or I've had other people talk about performance anxiety. If you have trouble, if you get nervous when you have to do public speaking, rather than saying, I am so nervous about giving that speech, if you just say, I'm kind of excited about giving that speech. So you're reframing that feeling of tension in your body, and you're not calling it anxiety anymore. You're now calling it excitement. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and I know this takes time, but mindfulness meditation is the best strategy I know of to help people learn to manage their emotions. And there's a lot of research to show its benefits. And the benefits are from as little as 5 minutes a day. There's some great apps out there to support people developing a mindfulness practice. My favorite is actually called Headspace. It has an annual subscription, but I think you can subscribe to the first 30 days for free. I've tried different, people may have other ideas about good mindfulness apps. I've tried others. What I really like about Headspace is I do guided meditation with Headspace, and I like the guy's voice. The person who's doing the guiding, they have to have just the right voice. And the guy who does Headspace was a former Buddhist monk from the UK, and he has an English accent, but it's not this proper upper crust English accent. It's a much more sort of working class English accent, which for some reason works for me. So, and if this is something you're interested in exploring, there's a great book called 10% Happier, which I would highly recommend. That's how I got my ADD son into meditation. I tried to convince him, because he also has anxiety. I said, you really should try meditation. And, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And Dan Harris, who's the author of 10% Happier, it's an engaging, it's funny. And he talked about how meditation sort of transformed his life. And so I would recommend that if you're looking for a way to ease into meditation. But that's what I would recommend.
Okay. Someone asks, how do imposter syndrome and rejection sensitivity dysphoria affect or relate to executive functioning skills?
Yeah, good question. I haven't seen imposter syndrome connected directly with ADHD. I have seen that. What's the other term for that? Rejection sensitivity
dysphoria.
Yeah, and clearly there's a lot of research coming out now to show that's the case. Both of those, from my mind, are associated with emotional control. And I think they don't necessarily go, not all people with ADHD have either one of those issues, but my experience from living with and working with people with ADHD is by the time they've hit adulthood, they've had a few slams in their life. And so those end up being triggers for them. And so they want to either avoid putting themselves in failure situations like they've experienced before, or they overreact to failure situations because it reminds them of, what they were like when they were teenagers and what they had to do when they were teenagers. But I think, again, reframing it, both those situations is probably the best bet. That rejection sensitivity dysphoria, that's another way of talking about perfectionism, right? Which is interesting because we don't necessarily talk about perfectionism with people with ADHD, but it's this, and I go back to, way back when I was in graduate school, there was a branch of therapy. It's a form of cognitive behavior therapy called rational emotive therapy. Albert Ellis was the guru of that. And he maintained that our neuroses are caused by two cognitive distortions, or two things we tell ourselves that aren't true, that get us in trouble every time. One of which is, I must be totally competent in everything I do. And the other is, I must be loved by everyone I know. And when you start thinking about both of those things, then you can see where we're really talking about one of those two things. You know, imposter syndrome is, I must be totally competent in everything I do. The other is, I must be totally loved and be totally competent in everything I do. So again, I mean, it's reframing that to understand, you know what, it's okay to make mistakes. The world is not going to fall apart if this doesn't work out the way you want. You can't be perfect at everything. Positive self-talk is the strategy for both of those.
Okay. Someone asks, how are ADHD executive skills related to social anxiety?
Okay, so again, there's not necessarily, I mean, there's nothing that says you can't have two different things going on. So I don't think there's anything in the symptoms that's directly associated with ADHD that would lead someone to have social anxiety. On the other hand, with the symptoms associated, let's say you have problems with impulsivity and you have problems with blurting stuff out and saying stupid things or doing stupid things. Sooner or later, you're going to get cues from your environment that people giving you negative feedback. And then you think, oh, I don't want to subject myself to that. And so there's the social anxiety. So it can be connected, but I've also seen, you know, people with ADHD, particularly if they're the predominantly hyperactive impulsive type, who aren't even picking up on those cues. So they're not necessarily socially anxious. They may be socially inept, but they're not socially anxious. So it depends.
Someone asked, is it possible for executive skills to be stronger in one environment, such as work, but fall apart in another, such as home? Or is it that a person's coping strategies may be better in one environment than another?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I've heard the first part of that, and I haven't heard people make that connection to the second part. These skills are context dependent, context specific. So for sure, they can be different at home or at work. But I also think you're absolutely right that two things, that there are things in each environment that are different. And there are also coping strategies that you're using that are different. You know, so for instance, organization has been one of my executive skill weaknesses, but I was always more organized at work than I was at home because I was working in a mental health center. If I lost stuff, there were huge issues involved in that. There were HIPAA violations, right? And on top of that, I was getting a paycheck. I mean, there were so many forces that enticed me to be more organized at work than at home. So at home, there were none of those constraints. And on top of that, and you may have noticed this as well, if you are dealing with some executive skill challenges and you are working overtime to keep those executive skill challenges from getting in the way of you at work, by the time you get home, you're depleted. You know, so if you spend all your part of your day working really hard to be organized, the last thing you want to do when you get home is clean your study. Speaking personally. So hope that makes sense.
Someone asked, does shame impact our ability to deal with executive function challenges?
That's a really good question as well. And that's something I've learned from working with the adults with ADHD that I've worked with over the years. That shame is sort of a hidden factor. And in fact, just being able to label it, I think may help you sort of learn to manage it better because it's a trigger, right? Something happens and it triggers a feeling that goes back to the shame you felt when you got hammered for that, you know, maybe 10 years ago when you were in high school. Shame just, because then you have to deal with the shame. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. That's when you have to start challenging where that shame came from and what you can do about it. That's where you say, you know, this is not my fault. This is a condition that I've worked really hard with that has thrown me a few ringers over the years, but I think I'm managing pretty well. I'm not going to allow myself to feel shame over this. Or with a more mindfulness meditation approach, look at the shame, accept it, and say, okay, let it go. And that's part of the mindfulness, especially on emotional control. You acknowledge the feeling and you say, okay, let it go, or let it be. Either one of those.
Okay, that's wonderful. But unfortunately, that has to be our last question because we're out of time. So Dr. Dawson, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with our ADHD community. We appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. It's been fun.
And thank you to today's listeners. If you would like to access the event resources, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 531. The slides and recording are posted a few hours after each live webinar. If you're listening in replay mode, simply click on the episode description. Please know that our full library of ADDitude webinars is available as a podcast. It's called the ADHD Experts podcast, and it's available on most streaming platforms. We hope to see you again next week for a free webinar on the association between ADHD and schizophrenia. Make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at additudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.